Hello, I'm Tracy Nicholas, and welcome to Folkloring. I am a passionate folklore practitioner, and to me, folkloring is more than just a podcast. It's my commitment to help you connect with your roots and awaken the wisdom within you. Hi, everybody, and welcome to this episode of Folkloring. And I have here with me today Wes Al-Dhaher, and he is the founder of Tales of Car, and he's a graphic novelist, and he's the series creator of a fantasy comic series called Brotherhood of the Wolf, The Lesser Evil. So, welcome, Wes. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be on.
So before we get into the interview, I wanted to tell you guys how I've been folkloring lately. And this one is kind of a fun one, and it's so much easier than it sounds. I have been working on making some duck ham. And duck ham is very much, it's more like a beef jerky, and super simple. All you do, I got a couple of duck breasts, and I packed them in salt for 24 hours. Then I wrapped them up in cheesecloth and hung them up in the refrigerator. I'm going to leave it in there for about a week. And then they're going to sort of get firm and be a really nice little jerky-like kind of thing. Super salty, but delicious. So that's what I've been doing. And what about you, Wes? How have you been folkloring?
Yeah, well, I've been folkloring is like, so I see a naturopathic doctor and I'm like, doctor, I'm trying to lose weight. And he's like, back and forth questions. And it's like, okay. And I tried all this dieting stuff. It doesn't really stick. What's going on? And he asked me some more questions and I'm like, well, I realized that when I went overseas for a vacation. I lost a lot of weight without having to focus on any diet or any exercise. My diet was actually less stringent than it usually is when I'm in the US. I'm like, what's going on? Well, it's like, well, clearly you're a very stressed out guy, and and you probably lost weight because of you were less stressed because you were on vacation. I'm like, oh, so what do I do? And so he's like, well, you got to figure out how to manage stress, and that's a very deep internal thing. But there are ways to kind of help move things along the process. And he mentioned something called ashwagandha, which is an herb that helps with angry caloric people like me be less angry and caloric
Ah,
and crotchety. So what I do is I starting to take before I go to bed, I take a tablespoon of ashwagandha and mix it with water and drink it. And the problem with ashwagandha is literally tastes like dirt. It tastes like literal dirt. And so when you but I, I still I still just power through and just swallow it and make some noise and pound my chest and congratulate myself for drinking a dirt herb. And yeah, so that's how I've been folkloring,
very
Tracy.
nice. Yeah, I
Not
used
not as not as fun as duck ham, but there you
No,
go.
definitely not. I used to get acupuncture, and I was taking some Chinese herbs that my acupuncturist would make, and I was working with my doctor, and she said because of my allergies, I have a fluctuating blood pressure. And
Yeah.
so she said that I could get off the blood pressure medication that I was on because my blood pressure would go high, but then when it would drop real low, I was still on the blood pressure medication. So
Yeah.
like I'd be passing out. And so I got on these Chinese herbs, and I always thought that it tasted like a combination of dirt and sort of like the musty dust that you'd find inside a suitcase stored like in a basement. I was like, that's the exact
Oh,
taste. It was terrible.
I think there's something to it where they try to make medicines taste not good because you feel like, well, if it tastes like crap, it probably is doing its job. I think there's a psychological aspect to that, but
It
I
could
can't
be.
prove it.
It could
Yeah.
be. I'm a big believer in the power of the placebo.
Yep.
Okay, so let's get into it. Can you tell listeners a little bit about yourself and your journey that got you to where you are today?
Yeah, so I'm Wes Al-Dhaher, creator of the Brotherhood of the Wolf dark fantasy series, and really, I was not into the creative arts as a much at all. I was very much a consumer. I read a lot. I watched a lot of TV when I was a kid, that sort of thing. But I always felt like the creative part of it was for other people to do, right? And so when I was in university, I read an article that pretty much changed everything, although it planted the seed that started to bloom many years later. And that article was written by a guy called Shibli Zeman. And the title of the article was like How Muslims Killed Dracula. And it revealed that Vlad the Impaler's brother, younger brother Radu, is called Radu the Fair, Radu the Handsome, was actually an Ottoman hero who helped conquer Constantinople and would later kind of fight his own brother, would later fight Dracula. And that hit me, and it's like, wow, when was the last time you heard that? I mean, of all these Dracula movies that come out, and I know, like, as of this recording, Nosferatu was recently, like, in theaters. So there's a huge amount of Dracula content out there, but we never really hear this. And so what's going on? And I dived into it a little bit, and Professor Jack Shaheen, I think he was a professor of communications in your neck of the woods, Tracy, like in the Midwest. I think he was a professor of communications at I think in a university in Indiana, and he
Okay.
actually wrote a book called, which was later turned into a documentary called "Real Bad Arabs: How Hollywood Vilifies the People," and "real" spelled REEL.
Huh.
And his thing was like, by looking at like around 1,000 movies between the late 1800s, which is when cinema became a thing, the late 1800s to like the year 2000, like around 1,000 of those that featured either Muslims or Arabs, like I think 12 of them showed them in any kind of somewhat positive light. And so I was like, whoa. So like that kind of drived, right? Like growing up, looking at TV, it's just like, yeah, it does seem, to use his term, the trope was like either bombers, belly dancers, or oil sheikhs seems to be the thing. And so it's like, well, okay. And then I just sat back and just like went on along my about my life, hoping, well, somebody will address this. But year after year after year after year, nobody really addressed it. And as I'm observing Hollywood, the output of Hollywood, just in terms of quality of the storytelling, seemed to be going down, regardless of like putting aside the topics of that Dr. Shaheen talked about, just in general. The output of Hollywood just started to suck more and more, if I can be frank. And so I'm like, well, okay, just me waiting for the problem to go away didn't really solve anything. So I'm like, let me just try it myself. And so initially, I thought that it was going to be it might be a series of novels that I would write. But then as I wasn't writing these. I didn't want to write these for myself just to scratch my own itch. I wanted to like, entertain the masses. And so I started talking to people who will be in my target market, and I'm like, so what books do you guys read? And they're like, huh? Books? I'm like, oh no. And so I'm like, well, I don't have the budget to make a movie, but what about a comic book where, because I was a huge fan of manga, I still am. And so obviously it would be a comic book series that would really respect the medium and take advantage of the medium of comic book, that the comic book medium provides, as opposed to, a lot of indie comic book creators, Tracy, they have this model where it's called the maybe movie model, where they create a mediocre comic book series without really hoping that Netflix will just pop in and give them a stack of cash, and that'll be that. And that's not a good model to do. Like I really wanted to give the comic book medium its due, and so I'm like, okay, I had to find the right people to do it, and it took a while. Started writing a bunch of scripts, but like yeah, and by that time, like I had issue number one complete. But then as I recruited some people who take to help with that, professionals from Hollywood, we came to the realization that, you know what, I needed to nuke most of these scripts that I spent over a year writing. Like we needed to do a soft reboot, and that was painful, but we did.
That's rough.
So then we went and said, okay, let's do like a chapter zero of the series, and that's the lesser evil. So lesser evil that you read, Tracy, that's essentially a chapter zero of the series and kind of kicks things off.
Uh-huh.
And so for the Brotherhood of the Wolf as a series, it's like, you can imagine it's the year 1445, and the Ottoman Empire expands while like there's these dark forces lurking in the shadows. And so we have like four heroes. One of them is Koja, who shows up as the protagonist in the book that you read.
Mhm.
And they battle with supernatural horrors and inner demons. And you can kind of you could think of the series as The Witcher or Castlevania, but in a historical Ottoman setting, in the
Okay.
15th century, which
Whoa.
nobody's done. Nobody's done even close to approaching that. And so, and the Midwest review of books, they reviewed it and they called it easy to pick up and hard to put down. And that's just the lesser evil that you read, and that's just like we're trying to have that be the appetizer to the main course of the main series that comes after that. So yeah, that's what I'm about, and that's what we're doing, and it's quite exciting.
It sounds really exciting. So tell me, what are some, like, you said that there's some folklore in your work. What are some of the folkloric aspects that you drew upon and that pop up in the Brotherhood?
Yeah, so we weave well, what I try to do is like weave in folkloric aspects, that not just from the Ottoman milieu or the Balkan milieu, but just like pretty much anywhere in the world, but making it fit in the setting. So you get like jinns, you get secret alchemical societies, etc. Like vampires in the setting of the Brotherhood of Wolf are essentially people who are willingly possessed by a certain type of jinn
Okay.
demon character. And then the reason being is that and I think the film, I'll reference it again just because it's quite recent. Nosferatu did a really good job of kind of touching on that because the original idea of the vampire as a monster is this undead person who's reanimated by demonic entities, right? And drinks blood. And there's a lot of symbology behind that we could go into.
Mhm.
But I think a lot of times with vampire fiction, they try to be they try to be creative and take it in different ways. So sometimes you have interpretations of vampires as aliens, or interpretations of vampires, people who were affected by a certain virus that escaped the lab, or whatever. Whereas, like, no, if you look at the original vampire myth, if you will, it has very strong occult connections, and that's why I think Nosferatu, by Eggers, that's recently came out.
Mhm.
One of the reasons why it did so well is like it touches into that vein that pardon the pun that that hasn't been explored too much as of recently, and so we're definitely exploring that, and so that's just one aspect of like incorporating folklore aspect. Other aspects is we play with this. There's a certain creature that will show up later. She torments. Yeah, I'll spoil it here because by the time I mention it here, people are gonna forget when it happens. So we have a certain we have an alchemist who one of our main characters, and he's a kind of a jerk, know-it-all, smart aleck, and he always gets these letters. He's always corresponding with a certain lady, and these letters are written beautifully, and they smell perfumed, and it's like ooh la la. And he tells his friends, "Oh, you guys don't understand. You guys don't understand true love, etc." Well, we have after a certain amount of time of these of him getting these letters in the background, he finally meets her, and it turns out she's going to be this 7 foot tall female jinn creature that eats men. and so the reason is like, okay, there's this idea of the siren
Mhm.
in mythology, in Greek mythology. There's idea of the siren, and they call out to the sailors, and the sailors go crazy and sail to their doom towards these sirens. But also like in like the Southwest Asia and like Middle East, the idea of like the ghoul, where it's like this beautiful, alluring woman who beckons travelers to come, and when they get close enough, she eats them. She puts them in a pot and eats them. So it's this idea of the traditional ghoul siren folkloric monster,
Mhm.
but adding to that kind of a modern twist of like catfishing, right? And that's where the letters come in. So it's like instead of like sexy pics on social media, it's these alluring letters that draw the unwise man into to destruction. So those are like just two examples I could share. So those are like examples of like monsters that we have, like a certain twist on the vampire folklore, certain twist on siren folklore. Like one of the first main monsters that will show up in the series, once you go to issue number one, yeah, in the first story arc, I should say, of our main series, the first monster that I won't spoil it too much, but it's a 10 foot tall demonic automaton, and so that's like playing with the idea of the golem folkloric
Right,
idea,
right.
and AI, right? Playing with that. So yeah, there's a lot of things that we're doing. And a lot of the obvious visual folkloric elements. I think you will see them with the monsters, but it's baked in throughout because we try to maintain that historical verisimilitude where it's like, yeah, they're monster hunting, but they're very much a part of their 15th century Ottoman Balkan milieu.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so a lot of stuff will just come out that organically, naturally.
Well, that's kind of how folklore, I mean, folklore is a living thing, right? Like you can see the similarities between the stories of fairies and the stories of aliens. And that's a really obvious one. People get taken away and they disappear for a while and, who knows what happens to them and they think it's all great and then,
Yeah.
they're dancing with the fairies for however long until they're exhausted. So
Yeah.
I think that sort of drawing it into the things that people would be comfortable with today, but keeping sort of that, older sense of where the characters would be is really interesting.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the reasons why like it works because the genre that we're in is dark fantasy. If we
Hmm.
try to make it more sanitized, I think a lot of the power of these things might be lost
Hmm.
because you're forced to pull your punches. Not to say, with dark fantasy, it's very easy to try to be an edgelord and I'm just gonna add more blood and gore and to everything. And it's like, no, that's not necessarily the case. It's like whatever scariness happens is just an organic output
Hmm.
of the elements that are there. And it's just like, okay, we have these elements together. They interact with each other in terms of like, what a character desires versus what he needs, and trying to overcome his internal weaknesses and attaining an external goal. And obviously, there's stuff in the way of that. A lot of it, these fey elements, for lack of a better word. And so, let's see what happens, as opposed to just like, what can we do to really like scandalize and outrage readers because we want to be edgy.
Yeah,
That's there's a lot of that going on in the entertainment industry, and that's not very interesting to me because it's just very lazy and hackish,
right, right.
and I'm not about that.
Well, let's talk a little bit about sort of what your writing style is, and specifically your theory of magic and the five pillars of authentic storytelling.
Yeah. So yeah, so just people like acronyms, so I'm like I'll throw one in. Magic. So the M is like a realistic representation of Muslims. This series isn't just for Muslims.
Mhm.
Anybody who likes the dark fantasy genre and likes classic storytelling with complex plots, complex, not complicated. There's a difference, but like meaty plot. If you like all those things, then this series will for sure resonate to you. But the reason I'm talking about Muslim realistic depiction of Muslims is just because that's a particular pain point that we haven't really seen, and so just trying to be intentional of drawing it to the surface, but without doing the whole cringy self-insert thing. So
Yeah.
of the four protagonists that we have, Koja, the guy in the mask, who is Nikki Furo, who's the protagonist in the book that you read,
Uh-huh.
he's Greek.
Okay.
Jem is a Turk. Munir is from Andalusia in Spain, and Haider is from the Levant.
Okay.
And like and none of I'm I'm Palestinian. So Haider is like I consider him to be like from Lebanon or Syria, but that's not really a self-insert. So like and our creative director Sylvia is Bosnian. Ezra is a writer from based in Minnesota. Aurelio, the artist, is Sicilian. So none of these things that we're doing in these stories are self-insert, like, oh, look, we want representation. That's not the case. It's just like, no, let's show something fresh, something unique, something different that really speaks to the human condition, particularly having a conversation about heroism and what does that mean, and how can flawed people be heroes. And so
Hmm.
that's our focus. So I just wanted to be clear about the M part of that. And so yeah, the other thing is with the A, it's the authentic setting. So I mentioned the verisimilitude, just making sure that it's grounded, even though it's a lot of cool dark fantasy stuff is going on. Gripping narrative. I don't like fluff in narrative, and neither does Sylvia, our creative director, who kind of plots out all these stories. Like we are, we hate fluff. We hate what they call a filler. Certain. I grew up watching like manga, anime like Naruto, and because the cartoon, the animated series overtook the manga, the comic book,
Uh-huh.
they had to do just a bunch of filler episodes,
Mm.
and that really, really, really was like a pebble in my shoe.
Sure.
So I didn't like that happening to me. I don't want that to happen to anybody else. So we ensure that every page has like there's actual narrative drive going on.
Yeah, one of my
You know,
least favorite things is I think they call it lore dropping, where it's just like we're building this world and we're going to tell you all of, the background, and they don't they just like drop it on you in a big lump and like here's the history instead of weaving it in. That I hate that style of writing.
no, no, 100%. That's the thing is because lore is not a story, right?
Right. Right.
Lore is raw material to feed your story, and
Yeah.
to the extent that it's relevant to the narrative, it'll come out from the
Right.
narrative. But it's in and of itself, lore is not valuable to your average reader.
Well, right. It's like if you're talking about going someplace that you've never been, right? It's like telling me about this place I've never been is not the same lived experience as me going there and seeing it and discovering these like little bits and pieces of history or whatever along the way. And that's how I want to be in a book too. I don't want you to tell me what it would be like if I would go. I want to go.
No, exactly, yeah, and 100%. And even then, it's like like for example with the Lesser Evil that you read, you'll notice we give just literally one page of a Star Wars style or Conan the Barbarian style intro at the very beginning, just telling you, hey, this is where we're at in time,
Mhm.
right? And then that's it. There's no more exposition. It's just the characters doing their thing. And hopefully that should do it really, because people want to be transported in a different world, but they want to experience it, and you telling it to them, especially in a visual medium,
Mhm.
is no good. Like it's not even good in prose, but in prose you can kind of get away with it a little bit more,
Yeah.
but you certainly can't get away with it in a visual medium like comic books or film or whatever. And it's even more important not to do that in games because I know like with games, like Sylvia has this thing of like they say in regular storytelling, it's show, don't tell.
Mhm.
Well, in games, it's play, don't tell.
Right.
So as much as possible, like it's not even about showing the story. The story should come out in the game mechanics. So that goes to the whole thing of just like really understanding and respecting the medium that you're in as a creator, so
Mhm.
that the audience can have extract maximum enjoyment. Because if I just wanted to read lore, I'd go over to Wikipedia, right? Like there's these wiki pages,
Right.
and so yeah, for sure. And so and then the I is like the imaginative world building, which to your point, we try to be careful about how we do it. And then there's cultural bridge building, which I think is pretty straightforward. And so eh, for us, it's like each story really should hit all five marks in order to be considered successful. I mean, they're like I would consider them necessary but not sufficient. And
Mhm.
so when somebody recognizes heroism, even if the reader is from Ireland or whatever, they'd be like, yeah, that's cool, that resonates with me. And so that's my hope.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I think it's very interesting when you were talking earlier about that the book, the real, what was the name of it? Real.
Oh, real bad Arabs.
Yeah.
Yeah, REEL. Yeah.
Yeah. And so when you were talking about that, and then when you started talking about the magic and that it's representative of Muslims, that it was, you have to go through this explanation of like, oh, we're not focused on only that, and it's not because it's like it such an expectation that like there are gonna like if you put people of different nationalities, different skin tones, that it's like so often they are the villain, and so to just be represented fairly, it's almost like you have to over explain it because people will be like, oh, we see what's happening here, which is obviously not the case, but it's just to try and get a fair representation you almost have to be an apologist for it a little bit. And that's a shame still, but you're breaking the ground, so it's good that you're doing this work.
Yeah, yeah, because people won't, I mean, at this point, like it's like, well, what can we expect? And for me, just like be very clear. And you'll notice in the lesser evil, um, do you know how many Muslim characters showed up in that chapter zero?
How many?
Zero.
Zero.
Zero Muslim characters show up in that, right? And because we're telling a particular setting of one of the protagonists 27 years before the
Right.
main series,
Right.
and and so that's what the story needed.
Mhm.
So, if we try to do the whole uh like being fanatical about representation type thing, we would have found clumsy ways to insert, but we didn't want to do that
Right.
because the point of the lesser evil with chapter zero of the series is to explore themes, right? When we talk about a realistic depiction of Muslims, it's not so much just like the demographic, but also the values and the underlying themes. And so, for the lesser evil, it's this idea. Where do we get that from? It's this idea like that Islamic law scholars, like Sharia scholars in the olden days, they talked about like if there's two, if there's two options and they're both evil, you're obligated to choose the lesser of the two evils. And that comes from a Quranic verse from the 64th chapter of the Quran that like talks about how like fear God all you can. So it's like, okay, well, fear God all you can implies that I can't do it 100%.
Mhm.
So there'll be situations where I like have to figure out, okay, I have this menu of options, they all suck. What's the one that sucks the least? And so that's the theme that we were playing, that is baked into the whole story of the Lesser Evil
Mhm.
regarding, you know, coach at the time, his name was Nick Euforos, and his mom, and the decisions that she has to make, etc. And so we were able to explore a very deep theme
Mhm.
that stems from something that comes from the Islamic ethical tradition, without having to drop in anybody with an Arabic sounding name or a Persian sounding name or a
Sure.
Turkic sounding name. And so that's how we like to do it. It's just like that level of sophistication.
Uh-huh.
And hopefully, based off of the early reviews that are coming in, people appreciate that because like, whoa, this really hits. And like, yes, it really hits because it's very thematically integrated,
Hmm.
as opposed to this very clumsy. Um, I know people talk about DEI, and you could say there's a good way, there's a right way to do it and a wrong way to do it. And a lot of times, what Hollywood does is the wrong way, where it's just like a very clumsy token
Right.
type. Let's just insert XYZ demographic, and it doesn't do the story justice. And so, hopefully, what we're doing is kind of solving that pain point for folks who want something better of their storytellers.
Yeah, I think that that's fantastic. Just the idea of we're going to sort of infuse these values that are representative of the Muslim faith, and instead of because it's easier to put a character in and just say there we represent it, and it's easier for the writers to just dump that in and not have to think about it. But I think you're right. There is definitely a wrong way to do it, and that's dumping a character in like that is absolutely the wrong way. So yeah, that's really cool. And it's not obvious because it doesn't need to be. I wouldn't have thought about that, right? But if it's supportive of the story in the right way, that's just like such a perfect way to get like your team's sort of values and mission into the story in a way that is really supportive of the reader.
Yeah, yeah, and the thing about theme, when you talk about what's the dramatic argument that the story is making, because every story that you read, I wrote an article about this that the Muslim Vibe featured on their website, which is this idea of theme, and the idea of like every story has a theme,
Mhm.
even if the intention of the writer is to have no theme. You can bet that there will be a reader who looks at that story and walks away with a theme, even if it wasn't your intention as a writer.
Right.
So knowing that that's the case, why not just be intentional about it and do it well?
Mhm.
And so the best stories they talk about, they have a dramatic argument, and they don't just argue one side of it. They explore both sides of it,
Mhm.
right? And they might have a bias, but they're professional enough where they do a good job of exploring both sides of it,
Mhm.
and lets the reader explore it through the conflict and the characters.
Right.
And then a great example of that is The Dark Knight. Like Christopher Nolan, the
Mhm.
probably
Yeah.
the best Batman, probably the best super. It's actually my favorite movie ever, like ever. Like that and Dread, but
Oh, that's a good
I
one.
digress. Yeah. I but so with the Dark Knight, like what is it? It's like the whole story is centered on the theme that like if people are left to their own devices, will they aspire to their more angelic aspirations? I use the word aspire twice, but their more angelic ideals, or will they just be animals,
Hmm.
right? And so the Joker is saying no. If people are like push comes to shove, people will literally eat each other,
Right.
and Batman is like saying no, I don't believe that. And that whole movie is just them having that argument.
Sure.
And so yeah, it works in beautifully.
I think that one of my all-time favorite folkloric characters is Baba Yaga. And because she is a truly ambiguous kind of character, right? Like, if you go to ask her for help, she might help you. She might help you if you do the right things. She might help you if you don't do the wrong things, or she might just kill you and eat you. Like
Yeah.
it's a complete, crapshoot of what it's going to be because she is operating under her own set of rules and values. And so you can't just go to her as the hero and be like, rescue me, because she might not. And she tests people. And then sometimes, even if they pass the test, she's like, nah, I'm going to put your skull on my fence. And
Oh, that's hilarious.
yeah. So yeah, and I think that it speaks to how people are, We're not always our best selves, but we're not always our worst selves either. And we have that struggle. And so that's why I think that that character to me is really meaningful because it's more nuanced than a lot of folklore characters.
Yeah, and I mean, one takeaway I take from that is like, Baba Yaga, very much like from the Eastern European world. And one thing about like East people of the Eastern European world, it's Slavs, they're very tough people, and probably have something to do with the harsh winters and just all that going on. So I would not be surprised if a big point of the Baba Yaga folkloric myth
Mhm.
is as a teaching tool to say, hey, you need to do the right thing. And even if you do the right thing, sometimes you won't get the results that you want, and you just have to live with that. And I'm like, yeah, that's
That's life.
that's a good way to that's a good way to put it across. Because like even if you dot all the I's and cross all the T's, you still might not
Right.
get what you want, and you should be okay with that. I think that's
Well, and the other thing is the rules are really random in like the Baba Yaga verse, right? Like she's got invisible servants that clean the hut, but then she's got the three riders, the black one, the red one, and the white one, right? You if you ask about the servants, which are invisible servants, right? She'll tell you. But if you ask about the riders, she'll kill you. Like, why? You
yeah,
know?
that's interesting. And like black, red, and white, they're like there might be some alchemical concepts in there, right?
It's night, dawn, and daytime.
There we go. Okay. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. So people who talk about like, poo-poo folkloric stories, but there's a lot of depth in there.
Yeah.
And I bet, your average folklorist storyteller from back in the day probably had more storytelling skill than the average writer's room right now in Hollywood. Because it's about the human condition, right? It's about like understanding the human condition and creating mechanisms, i.e., stories, to give people dramatic arguments that they can kind of subconsciously reflect on.
Right.
And they could reject them or ingest them, but it's there. Yeah,
And I think that in a lot of ways, the storytellers, when it was like still just an oral tradition, that they didn't have, I mean, they could certainly move around and, use different voices and sort of help the listener understand, but they didn't have the big full-blown visuals that we have in films today to carry them through, right? Like they had to do it all themselves. If they were playing music, they were, playing it themselves. And
yeah,
so yeah, they didn't that they the story had to stand because they didn't have a bunch of flashy stuff to distract people with.
yeah. I think then that's it's interesting that you said that about the visuals care because one of the things about in the 90s in the West in the US, it was a very interesting time for comic books in the
Mhm.
United States because there was like a boom and then a kind of a bust
Mhm.
because with the 90s you saw this huge output of like comic books that had great art, like really like wow art, but the
Mhm.
writing was bad
Mhm.
because in the 90s there was a shift where like artists started taking more control of the narrative
Mhm.
and writers took a backseat. So you'd like a lot of times have page after page of like just characters doing cool poses. There's like where's the story not so much of a primary consideration. And so that's the thing. It's like, yeah, I mean, visuals are important, but if the core narrative underneath it isn't there, people will just quickly forget about it, right?
Right,
And so
right.
that's why people look back on the 90s era of comic books and they'd be like, yeah, uh, it's great art. It's like, okay, well, what do you remember of the storylines? Well, uh, and so yeah, that's a great demonstration of the point you're making.
Yeah, 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 absolutely. Okay, so you try to encourage your readers to sort of join in community. What does that look like?
The first thing is about the community is if there's an overarching goal, like if the magic acronym appeals to you in any way, then you're already part of the community in an informal aspect.
Sure.
And so it's just like, okay, it's like, yes, this acronym, the magic appeals to me. I want more of the magic. I want to inject the magic in my veins. Um, uh, how do I go about that? And then that's where like some intentionality comes in. So for me, that's what I'm saying. The entertainment industry is changing where like it's becoming more decentralized.
Mhm.
So the 20th century, it's like the big studios produced everything, and indie creators were a thing, but not much visibility and not much as much output.
Mhm.
Now, people who want to create have a much better chance of doing so
Mhm.
because of reasons to do with technology and
Right.
industry that I won't go into. And so the onus is on us to actually start solving the problems that we want to solve
Mhm.
because constantly making YouTube videos, hate watching things that you hate, it gets you super chats, doesn't really solve the problem you're trying to solve or your audience tries to solve. So that's what I'm saying. Building the Brotherhood of the Wolf, I was very intentional. I did not want to I wanted to control our own distribution
Mhm.
and not rely on crowdfunding because with crowdfunding, there's this thing of like, well, I give you money so that you can produce a book. Like I know this happened to one creator I won't mention, but like people gave this guy money to crowdfund a book, and I think it's like 2 years now, and he hasn't released anything. But he's on YouTube constantly doing 4-hour streams, collecting super chats, talking about this, that, or another. I'm like, okay, yeah, that's not good. I don't want to be in a situation like that.
Right.
So I'm like, no, I will self-fund this. So I got skin in the game. I'm self-funding this from my own pocket, Tracy, my own pocket, to get this off the thing. And then in terms of
Yeah, I hope that
distribution,
you wouldn't self-fund it out of someone else's pocket because that's pretty much just stealing, right?
yeah, yeah. It's like, and if you want to do the crowdfunding thing, you have to like deliver when you say you're going to deliver. Just like 2 years,
Right.
it's just like outrageous. At least to me, maybe some people are okay with that. But and then distribution, like what, I'm going to do my own distribution because historically there's this thing called Diamond that did all the distribution of comic books.
Okay.
That's the organization, and now after the COVID lockdown era, they've pretty much run out of money and they're like bankrupt. And so all these publishers that have books to distribute, they're like scratching their heads figuring out what to do. And so Freeman's like, no, my vision is to get the book directly to you, no middlemen.
Mhm.
And so part of the community is being like, yeah, to protect ourselves from deplatforming or just like the fickle nature of tech organizations and what they deem to be good or not good. I'm like, to join the community, all you have to do is just share your email.
Yeah.
And in return for the email, you get an exclusive video that kind of shows you more of our characters and the story.
Mhm.
And that video is actually personally created by Sylvier, our creative director,
Okay.
who himself is a film student. So you're getting like high level production out of that. And then, every week I'll just give updates, share stories, kind of connect people about what's going on out there. And that's really the start of the community. So these emails that I've been sending out weekly, they're not spammy. They're like They're just me. They're me just talking about like what's going on, what can we do about it, with a little bit of just like a CTA. Just like at the end, I just be like, hey, you wanna if you'd like to buy a book, click this link, and that's it. But and so a very low investment way to join the community,
Mhm.
and you can dive in as much as you want, and hopefully, with the lesser evil, it's going to be the most affordable of the books that we release, and if it strikes your fancy, then everything else after that will just be that much better. So that's what I would say.
So do you have upcoming books mapped out?
Oh yeah. Oh yes, Tracy. Yeah, so the lesser evil is like I said, chapter 0, and we already have chapter 1. We already have issue number 1 done. Issue number 2 is currently in production. We're going to sell issue number 1 and 2 together as a 2-for-1 deal, just to show you guys how much we love and respect everybody. And to your question, we have like the plot of the series mapped up all the way up to issue number 15
Wow.
in detail, like in exquisite detail. We have it mapped out. So yeah, no, there's a lot of story. There's a lot of story, a lot of plot, and every page will be interesting. So no comic book pages of people sitting around a coffee table expositing. We're not interested in that. We like tight, action-packed stuff. So
So, my experience with publishing is in trad publishing, right? And so everything takes forever. And, my book just went into pre-sales and it's not going to come out for a year.
yeah.
So what does your production schedule look like?
Yeah, so the production schedule that we have is, well, yeah, we're not traditional because we control it. I am the publisher. So, but I would say that probably you'll get a book a quarter,
Okay.
and that's what we're going. And these books, by the way, they're not small. So what you read, Lesser Evil, was like 28 pages total,
Right.
but the issues after that will be at a minimum like 32 pages
Mhm.
of actual comic book story, like fully colored letters, sound effects, all that stuff. And so, even with that in mind, yeah, I think a quarterly schedule is what we have.
I'm still feeling like graphic novel encompasses that better than comic book because it just seems like it's also, detailed and weighty and
No,
it's
it is.
big stories and
No, it is. Like I think, like if you were to compare it to, like it would be more like a bande dessinée from the Franco-Belgium world, which is like these very premium graphic novels, as opposed to like a regular 20-page comic book that you get your look. So yeah, that's right. I was afraid to use graphic novel because I was afraid it made me sound pretentious, but I'm this deep in it, Tracy. Yes, graphic novels.
yes,
Exactly.
definitely own it. You need to own
I'll
it.
own it. I own it.
Okay.
Exactly.
Now we talked a little bit about this when we were talking about values and such earlier,
Yeah.
but as I was perusing your website, I saw that you have some goals beyond pure entertainment. And, maybe you can touch on some of those.
Yeah, so beyond entertainment, we're proving that classic storytelling, as I described it earlier,
Mhm.
rooted in fresh ideas, can captivate any audience, especially those who are, like I said, tired of Hollywood and the literary world, endless deconstruction of everything. Like, oh, we're telling Winnie the Pooh, but what if it was a horror? Okay, no, that one is fun. That's pretty cool. But like the other stuff, like where they're like constantly trying to deconstruct things. Like The Boys does it,
Yeah.
playing with a with the superhero idea. They did it pretty well. But then other series, like it's just like stop. Right? And so for us, it's like, no, it's not deconstruction. We're focused instead on exploring heroism, but exploring heroism by looking at how do flawed individuals rise above their circumstances to be kind of like a light in a world full of unremitting darkness, right? Because there's a lot of scary stuff happening here,
Mhm.
and none of our heroes is perfect, right?
Mhm.
Like one guy has anger issues, the other guy's a narcissist, the other guy is a former addict, the other guy has his head so far up his own butt that it's just like they're flawed characters, but
Right.
the point of like exploring heroism is how do they transcend that to be something better. And by the way, in our series, we're not afraid to kill off protagonists. We got kind of a George R. R. Martin type thing. So
Oh,
just mentioning that. So yeah,
I'm going to be shaking my fist at you.
yeah. And so that's why like one of the early reviews, Literary Titan, praised our work as a dark and compelling tale of political intrigue. And that's true. That's like one surface level aspect of it. But hopefully what we're trying to do is show that great storytelling transcends cultural boundaries or even your typical genre convention. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, I always think it's interesting when people don't realize that, for example, Gulliver's Travels was political satire,
Yeah.
and they just read it as the story. And so, if you can get people interested in the story and still get your message through that way, I think that's great.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, for me, it's just like, if you read the story and you're like, I don't know what the message is, but man, it was entertaining. I'm like, done,
Yeah.
done,
Yep.
mission accomplished. So that's the main thing. It's like entertainers need to entertain,
Mhm.
and really good entertainers say something valuable in their works, but they never forget that this is a work of entertainment. Like people are tired, people have bills to pay, some people might be living paycheck to paycheck. Other people have like kids and parents and spouses to take care of.
Right.
When they go to unwind, they want to escape a little bit.
Right.
And if you're not doing that because you want to be some sort of activist,
Mhm.
then that's just not very good. That's what I would
Right.
say about that. Yeah,
Right. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to end a book and be like, "Oh, I understand what the lesson here was," right?
exactly.
I want to end a book and wonder how the entire world is continuing on while I'll never be able to experience this world again for the first time. And
No.
I'm like, I don't want to talk to anybody for days because I'm still mentally living there.
Yeah, yeah. No, like I had one early reviewer being like, "Hey, what happens to so and so? Like this book has been living rent free in my head for days." And I'm like, "You're welcome."
That's awesome.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so can you tell listeners where people can find your self-distributed work?
Yeah, so very simple. Just go to our website, talesofkhair.com. So TALESOFKHAYR.com to get previews and join our free newsletter. Limited print editions coming soon. And yes, I'm not joking when I say every comic is going to be a collector's piece because there are no digital versions, right?
Oh,
There are no digital versions. Sorry to this sounds crass, but just to, as the late great Stan Lee said, who is like, comic books are like boobs. It might be nice to look at one on the screen, but it's much better to have one in your hand. Despite the crassness of that
awesome.
statement, I agree. Like it's much better to hold a comic book in your hand, and so we will always have them be physical
Okay,
media,
great.
not digital.
And I will have the website in the show notes so people
Excellent.
can get that. Okay, so before we wrap it up all together, do you have any final thoughts?
Yeah, I just say, look, stories shape how we view the world and how we view ourselves. And so with the Brotherhood of the Wolf, I would hope that we're not just telling cool tales about catfishing Jinn and demonic automaton and vampires, but that we're building bridges between people and that people kind of in this world of deconstruction and everything seems so cynical that no, I mean, heroism is a thing.
Mhm.
It's deep within every person. And that by enjoying these stories, like you're entertained, it's a great yarn, but you're also like learning something about yourself and maybe giving yourself a break and not being so cynical about things all the time. But that's just my hope that people take away from. But with art, people usually take things away from it that you might not expect. So yeah, let's take it one page at a time. Of
Great. Well, thanks so much, Wes. Thanks for taking the time to be here today.
course, thank you, Tracy. Appreciate you.
As always, thanks for listening to Folkloring. If you liked what you heard, please consider leaving a rating and review. And don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast app so you never miss an episode. If you have any questions or comments or would like to suggest a topic for a future episode, please email us at folkloringpod@gmail.com or message us on Facebook or Instagram. Other places you can find me are at the Folklore Podcast as the theater, film, and storytellers correspondent, or creating folklore-inspired games at madmenandheroes.com. Stay curious, stay connected, and keep the traditions alive. And I hope that wherever you are, folklore is making your life more magical.